Okay, yeah. Hi, everybody. Ben Hart again here, and much appreciated. Anybody who's watching this, yet again, these are kind of videos I almost use to sort of organize my own thoughts on all of these issues, but they're also sort of videos that maybe it can provide some insight to other people. I thought of making this one after I watched a recent clip on YouTube from George Gammon, who was talking about the BRICS and the dollar, and he was kind of saying, "Come on, who's really going to throw in with the BRICS?" Da da da. And he had a good point. It was an interesting, and I really like George Gammon a lot, and I don't really think we even disagree. I think we just see this thing from slightly different perspectives, or maybe fundamentally different perspective actually. But he brought up the thing I would, and I'll try to put the link in the description below to his video, but the thing I sort of took away from it is I don't think people in the West, I think they're looking at this BRICS Plus thing, and they're seeing it as in sort of a dialectic, which always you need to be very careful of falling into that like BRICS Plus versus the dollar sort of as a dialectic. And that's not what I think is actually going on here. In fact, I thought of titling this video, and it'll probably end up being the title, even though it's really long, is BIMSTEC, BRICS, BRI, mBridge, SCO, and ASEAN, welcome to multipolar Asia. My point with all of this has been, I probably could have mentioned the ACU, the Asia Clearing Union in there, which I'll get to in a minute when we discuss this BIMSTEC thing, is what we're seeing here is just a fundamental shift across the board in the infrastructure of trade, where up to now we've really had sort of I hesitate to call it unipolar, but effectively a single set of, we've had sort of a unified or monolithic, maybe monolithic is the right word, a monolithic system in SWIFT for moving money around the world, or capital, I should say, for the purpose of trade or doing business. It looks to me like that is fragmenting, and that's the point I'm trying to make. And BRICS is an example of that. It's not the only one, as I'll get to here. I actually saw in the print edition of the Bangkok Post this article, and I'll link to it in the description below, but the article is titled BIMSTEC, a New Force of the Global South. And I want to read a couple of excerpts here, quoting directly. All of a sudden, the countries around the Bay of Bengal are coming to the fore and raising their profiles. They know full well that this vast maritime enclave, with its plentiful resources and potential benefits, is another important strategic landscape. So it is better to get their act together. And then, okay, so what is this BIMSTEC, BIMSTEC? Quoting further, the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, BIMSTEC, is quite unique as it comprises the world's largest democracy, India, 4 other South Asian countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Nepal, and 2 ASEAN members, Thailand and Myanmar. So let's go back and look at this real quick. India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal, Thailand, and Myanmar. When I was discussing in the prior video about the Asia Clearing Union, we were discussing that presumably this has already happened, July 15th, that these countries were moving away from the SWIFT system and were going to Iran's CPAM system. Now, I don't know if that's exclusively or they're just going to start using it as an alternative. CPAM, by the way, is spelled SEPAM. And they were talking about the Asia Clearing Union was moving to that. Now, the countries in that Asia Clearing Union were India, Pakistan, Myanmar was mentioned in there. I believe Nepal was in there. Sri Lanka was in there. I don't know if I recall Bangladesh being in there, but it was not, if not quite congruent to this 100%, very, very close. The parallels are there in terms of the countries involved. So the thing to take away from this is I find it interesting, this BIMSTEC, if you read in that article, again, I'll put a link in the description. If you read in that article, this thing has kind of been dormant for a number of years, and it's now sort of coming back online. And again, Myanmar is in that Asia Clearing Union that's sort of moving over to this CPAM system. Thailand is not in that, but it's in this BIMSTEC. And now BIMSTEC is sort of coming again to the foreground. And I thought this was especially interesting, quoting further, same article, quoting directly, at the retreat, there was a broad agreement on the importance of creating crisis response mechanisms to coordinate different contingencies. And then it goes on to say, furthermore, the meeting also considered establishing digital payment systems and trade settlements, as well as strengthening cooperation in cybersecurity and the prevention of transnational crime. So BIMSTEC now is looking at, and I quote again, establishing digital payment systems and trade settlements. So again, this is all in the same line of reasoning as we've been talking about with respect to BRICS. And here recently, it's been announced Russia is going to this ruble CBDC. And I don't think people are fully looking at all aspects of the notion of a CBDC. I think, especially for YouTube, people run out there and they concentrate on, yes, this thing it's got dystopian overtones, it's got dystopian undertones, it's dystopian. If we all go to cashless using CBDCs, that's a hellscape I don't particularly want to live in, and I completely agree. But there's another side to CBDC, and that's central bank digital currencies, a currency that moves between central banks. And this is what I don't think people are fully realizing in terms of the infrastructure of international trade, the infrastructure of international finance. And again, I couldn't agree with George Gammon more. I don't believe this is de-dollarization per se. And in fact, I don't even believe we're going to see this as a hit, quote unquote, to the dollar. If anything, I foresee there being more demand for exactly the reasons Mr. Gammon points out in his videos. And he's better at doing that. I'm not going to get into all the detail because he will drill down into the into the micro. And he does a great job of that. But he gets into why there's going to be more demand for the dollar. In a sense, I think in a broad, and I'm almost speaking to people 100 years from now when I say this, because I don't mean to say this to freak people out, but I think what we're going through is a crack-up boom in terms of the dollar, which is going to lead to this multipolar world utilizing these CBDCs. Or I should say, that's what I think the global Sherpas would like us to do. I don't know that I agree with this. I'm just talking about it because I can kind of see it I think I see it for what it is, and I don't see a lot of people out there talking about the infrastructural side of this. But again, so a crack-up boom in the dollar, and I think that this is going to happen in two fundamental ways. One, there's going to be demand for digital dollars, if you will, because the Eurodollar system plumbing exists. There's all kinds of loans and things that are out there that still exist in dollars, have to be paid off in dollars. So there will be demand for ongoing digital dollars. But more importantly, and a point that's brought home, a fine point of which is brought home in a book called The Oligarchs, which talks about the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of the oligarchs. They talk about how there were ledger rubles and cash rubles. And one guy who managed to corner the market on a lot of actual goods in Russia was a guy who figured out the difference and figured out that he could go in and take cash rubles and exchange them for ledger rubles with the banks, because the banks in the Soviet Union did have what were akin to banks. Although you could make an argument they looked a lot more like non-bank entities. And by the way, Mr. Gammon brings up a really good point about the fact that we need to keep the heavy regulation on non-bank entities that we have in the United States. That regulation needs to remain. It needs to stay in place. It absolutely needs to stay in place to keep the worst dystopian aspects of this quote-unquote CBDC, FedNow, and all of that stuff from integrating together and becoming the hellscape that we think it could ultimately be if it's rolled out in the way that it could be. Leaving that where it is, though, going back to the oligarchs, what I'm talking about here is this Russian oligarch figured out there was a difference between ledger rubles, which were just on computers, and cash rubles. And I think during this crack-up boom that we may be seeing forthcoming in terms of the dollar. There's going to be intense demand for dollars in terms of digital dollars because, again, that euro dollar plumbing, the overall plumbing of the international trading world, although some of that may become decoupled as a result of this new BRICS trading currency and some of these other developments, BIMSTEC, CPAM, the ACU, the Asia Clearing Union. And then again, ASEAN has come out and said that they're looking for alternatives to the dollar in terms of national currencies. That's going to be very interesting to watch ASEAN specifically. The cool thing I think about ASEAN is ASEAN does not have a currency union, and they know their limits, if you will, that none of the countries, I think, in ASEAN particularly want a unified currency because they know that the specifics of their own national governments, their own national economies, don't warrant it, and it would not be in those countries' best interest to try to unify the currency. I mean, the euro has not been a resounding success by any metric. It's been mildly satisfactory, I think, by any estimate. That said, going back to this situation of a sort of crack-up boom, demand for digital dollars, I think, is going to be there. But where I really think we're going to see a major demand, especially internationally and maybe even in the United States, is going to be for cash, actual cash, in your hand cash. I remember talking to a friend of mine a few years ago about a scene in, of all movies, I believe it's Alien 4. It's a scene with Dan Hedaya, and I believe it also has Dennis Leary in it. I think it's Alien 4, Alien 5. It's one of like the later Alien movies. But it's this scene where these mercenaries have been contracted by the government of the time to go track down the aliens. And they meet up with the government personnel who's contracting them, and he hands him this pile of cash. And he says, "You have no idea how hard this was to come by. Why do you need cash anyway?" is what he asks. I believe it's Dennis Leary. And he says, well, when you don't want anybody to know what you're doing, you like having cash. That's the point of cash, is privacy. But the point that I'm trying to make with this video and just sort of in general regarding the difference between cash and digital currencies, I don't believe they're going to outlaw cash. I don't believe they're going to get rid of cash. I think they're going to try to phase it out. But what I do think is going to happen is there's going to be a crack-up boom demand for dollars. And I think a part of that, there's going to be an even more acute crack-up boom demand for cash dollars, actual physical paper dollars. For the exact same reason, there was a massive demand for paper rubles as the USSR was kind of unraveling and their banking system was having the problems that it had. There was a rush to the cash ruble. And I think this will happen for much the same reasons if and when we do see ultimately a crack-up boom in the dollar, which I think we're gonna actually see. So again, same dynamic as in Russia, but sort of in a more international context now. Then in tandem with that, we're going to see, in my opinion, these countries, which they've already said it from the BRICS Plus, it's my understanding, they're going to denominate in both dollars and the BRICS Plus currency when that thing comes online, the trade currency, I should say, which, again, it's more like a perfected SDR is what they're going for, not so much a currency as we know it, a street-level currency, as I would call it. So, again, they're going to use they're going to denominate commodities, services, goods, things like this. At least in Asia, it looks like they're eventually going to denominate in both. I think we could see a situation where they're denominating in multiple CBDCs. And again, in terms of central bank digital currencies, these may not be reflected in the national currency at the street level. But again, the Russians have said that they're going to have this ruble CBDC. Well, again, we need to go back. We need to look back a little bit and understand we could end up in a situation very much akin to where the pound is at even today, where there still exists a pound area, an area where the pound is used as the lingua franca, if you will, the coin of the realm, if you will, that where it's still used as the fundamental currency, trade or otherwise. I think we could see the same thing as these CBDCs are coming online, as BRICS Plus is coming online, as we're seeing the Asia Clearing Union doing their thing, this CPAM system coming online. Now we're sort of seeing another level of this where we're into this CBDC. So example, I could see where the ruble area, if you will, Like there's a pound area, there becomes a ruble area. I'm betting that's probably going to look much akin to what CSTO is, CSTO, which is sort of the Russian analog to NATO, but in sort of Central Eurasia. The stands, if you will, it's my understanding, are all members of this CSTO, and I could see maybe the ruble area encompasses that. Meanwhile, the yuan as a CBDC in its own right, setting aside again the BRICS currency because that would operate as a trade currency. So that's sort of a tabulation of these different CBDCs against one another, tabulated in gold. At least that seems to be the plan as it's coming about. So again, China, the digital yuan, you could see a yuan area, and that area might expand as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative. So the yuan area obviously is mainland China today, but as the BRI expands, we may see that yuan area expand as well. Meanwhile, again, maybe the way to look at this is differing syndicates. Again, in the India-dominated global south, we got CPAM, which apparently operates in tandem with Iran because Iran is an oil producer, but via the Asia Clearing Union, India may be sort of coming under that sort of syndicate in the global south. Again, China via the BRI, again, and they have the CIP system, CIPS, which is, again, an alternative to SWIFT, much in the same way CPAM is an alternative to SWIFT. So you've got to have the infrastructure, the SWIFT-like infrastructure in the form of CIPS or CPAM, and then you get these CBDCs or BRICS Plus, arguably, too. That may operate as a trade currency, and that may also have the infrastructure which is akin to SWIFT. So again, it's one layer, and then on top of that, you have the CBDC layer. Again, the Russian ruble would be for CSTO. Then you've got the ASEAN currency area. I think that's going to be interesting because I think that's fundamentally going to be national currencies in ASEAN sort of bouncing off of the U.S. dollar. I think the U.S. dollar and SWIFT probably remain in much the same way as they are now. There's just more usage of national currencies within ASEAN. But then as we talked about, then we've got mBridge coming in, where Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Bank of Thailand, and their relevant counterparts in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, have come out and said they're working together to build this mBridge, which will then hook into dealing with the CBD system coming out of mainland China. On top of all of this is all occurring at the same time that we're looking at a meeting between the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS, which at least Alistair McLeod is out there saying this. I think there's others that have said it as well. I tend to think that they probably are onto something with the notion that this may result in the combination of BRICS and SCO. They essentially combine and become sort of the same thing, which again would seem to suggest, again, this sort of layered system where you've got the underlying trade currency, if you will, or the underlying trade currency infrastructure, that might be the better word for it, and then you've got the actual CBDC operating, and then you've got the differing nodes along the world island that is Eurasia. Again, Hong Kong, Thailand, Bank of Thailand, so Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Bank of Thailand, relevant counterpart in the UAE, they're operating as sort of the outer edge of what this Eurasian landmass is turning into, it looks like. They're going to be the ones that are communicating or interacting, if you will. Communicating is the wrong word. Interacting in a trade sense in very much real time, very much boots on the ground with what I would call sort of the maritime periphery, what Mackinder called the periphery. I don't believe it's going to be a periphery. Zbigniew Brzezinski was terrified of the Western powers, the Western alliance becoming the periphery. I don't think there's reason to be terrified about that. I think actually as Eurasia comes more online and becomes more of a powerhouse in terms of industrialization, you're just going to see more trade with the maritime world, the thalassocracy. I can't pronounce that correctly. Thalassocracy or thalassocracy, basically a maritime empire, which is what you're looking at in terms of the Western alliance and how I think it's going to interact with this Eurasian sort of, again, economic powerhouse. Interestingly enough, you made a Venn diagram of all this BIMSTEC, BRICS, BRI, mBridge, SCO, and then ASEAN. Depending on where Thailand decides to sort of shake out in all this, I suspect they'll essentially be on good terms with everybody. But Thailand will sort of sit as this one operator in this kaleidoscopic Venn diagram of all these different syndicates simultaneously operating. Thailand just yet again sits in the middle and does its own thing, gets to benefit from all sides of that. I could see that definitely happening. But again, and I think it goes without saying, or should go without saying, SWIFT is going to remain. That's going to remain a viable. You can continue to use SWIFT. Now, as Mr. Gammon pointed out, they're upgrading it. And it's actually kind of creepy. As he talked about in the video, I think I'll find the link and I'll put it in the description. He talked about MX, where previously SWIFT was able to transmit messages regarding money that was pretty simplistic messages. But now it's going to be able to use rich text and all these dynamic properties for transmitting this information. Well, as he points out, it's because it's transmitting all of your digital data, your social security number, your personal data, all of this stuff that's associated with who's transferring to where. I think competition in terms of these trade infrastructures is a good thing, because maybe we get to the point where SWIFT becomes a system wherein if you try to wire money internationally, it essentially requires your retinal scan and to allow all this biometric data and the history of your entire financial transactions, your vaccine history. One of my big problems that I saw during the quote-unquote pandemic was the immediate, just complete throwing away, just casting off of medical privacy. That medical privacy just wasn't a thing anymore. We get to check your vaccine history to get on a plane to go to Delaware. It was just insanity to me. Well, it looks to me like, again, as what Mr. Gammon pointed out in his video, that MX function that's being brought, I believe it's MX, being brought online with regard to FedNow and sort of the internal system, and I'm presuming this is going to come out for SWIFT as well. They're going to have all of this rich data on everybody that's transmitting all of this money around. Well, if there's competition in terms of those trade infrastructures, people may want to choose the one that kind of prefers privacy. And I'm here to tell you, I'm pretty sure Asian business is going to prefer privacy. You know, you can say what you will about, you know, norms of democracy and things like that, or authoritarianism and how it operates in Asia. There's good points to that, and especially, you know, social credit scores and the problems you see in China. But that being said, Asians do get on with it, and they get on with their business. Alistair McLeod brought that up in a recent thing I was listening to him on. He said, look, say what you will about sort of the notions of, you know, freedom or whatever. You know, they don't go around spouting all of that stuff, but your day-to-day, you're much freer to do business in these jurisdictions than you might otherwise be in some of these alternative jurisdictions, for example, back in the West. So again, to sort of round this thing out, I think what we're heading to is much less of a dialectic between East and West in terms of where you're choosing to, or how you're choosing to transport capital over the infrastructure of trade. No, instead, I think what we're looking at is, again, multipolar is being used ubiquitously. Every time that happens, I don't love when that occurs, because then it's a word. It's a buzzword. It has connotations beyond its underlying meaning. But that said, multipolarity isn't a terrible word for it. It's more just everybody looking to doing, it's more sort of a concert of earth, if you will. Everybody's looking at doing their own business, taking care of their own interests, but then at the same time needing to operate with others in what I think is going to become sort of a globe which is dominated by a series of syndicates around the world in the form of this trade currency infrastructure, if you will. Different regions will have a predominant, like each one will have sort of a primary trade infrastructure system, if you will, currency infrastructure system. And then it may be possible to use other currency infrastructure systems. For example, I suspect SWIFT will be an option around the world. But then, here in Southeast Asia, for example, depending on where you're at, you may be able to use this BIMSTEC. They may set up a system, or you may use the Asian Clearing Union. You may use that system through CPAM, or you may opt to use SIPs or something. But again, you'll have options. That might be the way this is going. I'm not certain of that, though. It's very much still up in the air. And as a friend of mine who does watch these videos, and shout out to him, he knows who he is. He said, I tend to be a little too stream of consciousness in these videos. As I've said, I use these to organize my own thoughts in many ways. But yes, the practical applications at the street level of CBDCs are nothing but dystopian. I don't disagree with that at all. The notion of a cashless society is something we should be very, very afraid of for our own privacy. But that said, the notion of competition amongst trade infrastructure, that may actually augur well at the end of the day for the underlying individual or small businesses or just people who want to do business, be left alone, be left to their privacy. Again, how this all plays out remains to be seen. I'll certainly make some videos as and when I can based on anything that pops up into my vision that I think is worth it. So for folks that are watching, we'll see you later.